Hey, my name is Grace Whitfield. I'm 65 years old, and I live in a small house on Cedar Hollow Road, just outside Bristol, Tennessee. 3 days ago, a man who has brought me groceries every Sunday for exactly 52 weeks showed up at my door holding a bunch of white peonies instead of a paper bag, and I had to sit down on my own porch steps because my legs stopped working properly. I need to tell you how we got here, because it took me a year to understand something that had apparently been sitting in front of me since 1988. And if I don't say it out loud, I'm afraid I'll convince myself I imagined the whole thing. My husband Walter Whitfield died 14 months ago. Heart attack. Sudden. No warning. No goodbye. He was 67 years old and had just finished mowing the back lawn when he sat down in his favorite chair on the porch, said the words, "Gracie, I think I need a minute," and was gone before the ambulance made it halfway down Cedar Hollow Road. I remember the smell of fresh-cut grass on his shirt when I ran to him. I remember thinking absurdly that I needed to turn off the mower still idling in the yard, as if that mattered more than anything else in the world in that moment. I remember the paramedic's face when he looked up at me, and I understood before he said a single word. We had been married for 39 years. We met in college, married 2 years after graduation, raised 2 children in this same house, buried both of Walter's parents and both of mine, and built a life that felt, right up until that Tuesday afternoon, like it still had another 20 years left in it. It didn't. And the thing nobody tells you about sudden death is that grief doesn't arrive gently. It arrives like a truck, and it doesn't slow down to let you brace yourself. The first few months are a blur I still can't fully account for. My daughter Renee flew in from Charlotte and stayed 2 weeks, cooking meals I didn't eat and answering phone calls I couldn't bring myself to pick up. My son Michael drove down from Roanoke every weekend for a month, fixing things around the house that didn't need fixing because it gave him something to do with his hands, while his mother sat in a chair and stared at nothing. Eventually, they both had to go back to their own lives, their own children, their own jobs. And I understood that. I told them I understood that. But understanding doesn't make an empty house any quieter. Walter had done the things I never thought about. He handled the finances, changed the oil in both cars, knew which grocery store had the good tomatoes and which one overcharged for milk. He carried the heavy bags in from the car without being asked. He fixed the leaky faucet before I even noticed it was leaking. For 39 years, I had built my life around a man who quietly took care of 1,000 small things. And when he died, all those small things came crashing down on me at once, like a house whose foundation had been pulled out from underneath it. About 6 weeks after the funeral, on a gray Sunday morning in late October, there was a knock at my door. I opened it expecting Renee or one of the church ladies, who had been dutifully checking in on me, and instead found Samuel Reeves standing on my porch, holding 2 grocery bags. Samuel had been Walter's best friend since they were 19 years old, working together at the same feed store the summer before either of them started families. They had stayed close for 46 years, fishing together every spring, arguing about football every fall, standing up at each other's weddings, and eventually becoming godfathers to each other's children. Samuel's wife Dorothy had passed away 11 years earlier from ovarian cancer, and Walter had been the one who sat with Samuel through those long, terrible months, the same way I imagined Samuel would have sat with me if the order of things had been reversed. Samuel was 70 years old, tall and a little stooped now. With thick gray hair he kept combed the same way he had for decades, kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the weathered, sun-worn face of a man who had spent his life working outdoors as a contractor. He stood on my porch that October morning, looking almost apologetic. "Grace," he said, "I was at the store and I remembered Walter always said you couldn't stand grocery shopping. Thought you might need some things." I looked at the bags. Milk, eggs, bread. A bag of the good tomatoes from the store 2 towns over that I hadn't been to since Walter died because I didn't have the energy to drive that far. A rotisserie chicken, and a small bouquet of daisies tucked on top like an afterthought. I stood in my doorway and cried without meaning to. The kind of crying that arrives sideways, triggered not by grief itself, but by an unexpected kindness landing squarely on top of it. Samuel didn't say anything comforting or awkward. He just waited on the porch until I had gathered myself, then carried the bags into my kitchen and set them on the counter the way Walter always had. "You don't have to do this," I told him. He shrugged, not quite meeting my eyes. "Made a promise to Walter once. Man told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to make sure you were taken care of. Didn't think I'd need to keep that promise so soon, but a promise is a promise." I thought that was the whole explanation. I believed it completely. It would be almost a year before I understood there was more to it than a promise made between 2 old friends. Samuel kept coming every Sunday morning. He never called ahead. He never made it feel like an obligation or a chore. He would knock around 10, always with 2 grocery bags, always with something small tucked among the groceries, a bundle of flowers, a jar of local honey, a paperback novel he thought I might like. He would carry the bags in, help me put things away, and then, more often than not, he would end up staying for coffee. At first our conversations were mostly about Walter. Samuel had known him longer than I had, in some ways, and hearing his stories felt like being handed pieces of my husband I had never known existed. He told me about the summer they worked at the feed store and got fired together for accidentally releasing 40 chickens into the parking lot. He told me about the year Walter tried to build a boat in our garage and it sank on its maiden voyage in Cedar Creek, and how Walter had laughed so hard about it that he cried. He told me about the day Walter proposed to me, which I of course already knew from my own memory, but hearing it from Samuel's perspective, how nervous Walter had been, how he had practiced the speech in Samuel's truck for 2 hours beforehand, made the memory feel new again, like I was falling in love with my husband for the second time even though he was already gone. I looked forward to those Sunday mornings more than I wanted to admit. They became the one fixed point in a week that otherwise felt shapeless and gray. I told myself it was because Samuel kept Walter's memory alive for me, because talking about my husband with the one person who had known him almost as long as I had was its own kind of comfort. I didn't examine the feeling any more closely than that. I certainly didn't examine why I started putting on a bit of lipstick before 10 o'clock on Sunday mornings, or why I started keeping the good coffee in the house instead of just drinking whatever was cheapest at the store, the way I had started doing since Walter died and there was no one to impress anymore. Winter came, and Samuel kept coming. Snow on Cedar Hollow Road never stopped him. There was one Sunday in January when the roads were bad enough that Renee called to check on me and told me not to expect anyone to visit, and I found myself disappointed in a way that surprised me, and then relieved and a little embarrassed when Samuel's truck came crawling slowly up the driveway anyway. Chains on the tires, 2 grocery bags on the passenger seat. "You didn't have to come out in this," I told him at the door. Snow still on his shoulders. "Wasn't gonna let you run out of milk in a snowstorm," he said. Like that settled the matter, and it did. That winter, our Sunday visits started stretching longer. Coffee turned into lunch. Lunch turned into afternoons spent going through old photo albums, Samuel pointing out himself in the background of pictures from my own wedding, both of us laughing at the terrible haircuts and the terrible fashion of the 70s. He helped me sort through Walter's tools in the garage, a task I had been avoiding for months because I couldn't face it alone. He knew which tools Walter had actually used, and which ones had been gifts he never touched, and he helped me decide what to keep and what to donate, without ever making me feel rushed or pressured. One Sunday in February, we were going through a box of old photographs when Samuel went very quiet, holding a picture of himself and Walter standing in front of the feed store, maybe 20 years old, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning like the whole world belonged to them. "I miss him something fierce," Samuel said quietly. "Some days I forget he's gone, and I go to call him about something stupid, a ball game or a piece of news, and then I remember halfway through dialing, I reached over and took his hand. It was the first time I had touched him beyond a brief hug at the door, and something about the moment felt significant in a way I couldn't name yet. "Me too," I said. "Every single day." We sat like that for a long moment, 2 people who had loved the same man in different ways, holding on to each other's grief because it was the closest thing either of us had to holding on to him. By spring, I had started to notice things I hadn't let myself notice before. The way Samuel always remembered small details about my life, that I preferred my coffee with just a splash of cream, that I hated the taste of cilantro, that my knees ached worse in cold weather and better after I had been doing my stretches, the way he would linger a little longer than the errand required, finding one more small task to do around the house, a squeaky hinge to oil, a gutter to clean, before finally saying he should get going, the way he always parked his truck in the exact same spot in my driveway, as if some part of him had already decided this was a routine that would continue indefinitely. I mentioned it to Renee during one of our phone calls in April. "Samuel's still coming every Sunday," I said, trying to sound casual. There was a pause on the line. "Mom," Renee said slowly, "has it occurred to you that maybe Uncle Sam isn't just doing this because he promised Dad?" I laughed it off. "Renee, he's 70 years old. We're just old friends keeping each other company." "Mm-hmm," she said, in the particular tone daughters use when they know something their mother doesn't want to hear yet. I dismissed it. I told myself Renee was reading too much into an old man's kindness. But that night, lying awake in the bed Walter and I had shared for 39 years. I found myself thinking about Samuel's hands, weathered and strong from decades of carpentry work, and the careful, deliberate way he had held mine over that box of photographs in February. And I had to get up and make myself a cup of tea because my heart was doing something I didn't have a name for yet, and it scared me more than I wanted to admit. In May, something happened that cracked the whole thing open, though at the time I didn't fully understand what I had seen. Michael came down for the weekend and happened to be at the house when Samuel arrived on Sunday morning. The two men had always gotten along well. Michael had known Samuel his entire life, but I watched something pass between them that morning that I couldn't quite decode. Michael helped Samuel carry the bags in, and as they set them on the counter, I heard Michael say quietly, not quite quietly enough, "You gonna tell her yet? Or you just gonna keep bringing her flowers till she figures it out herself?" Samuel's face went the color of a brick. "Michael, I'm just saying, Uncle Sam, it's been 7 months. Dad would want you to just say something." I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, pretending I hadn't heard, my heart hammering against my ribs. Samuel noticed me a second later, and the conversation died instantly. Both men suddenly very interested in unpacking groceries. I didn't say anything that day. I filed the moment away somewhere deep and didn't let myself look at it directly. The way you don't look directly at the sun even when you know it's there. But it changed something. I started watching Samuel more carefully on our Sunday visits. I started noticing the way his eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his voice softened when he asked how I was really doing. Not the polite version of the question, but the real one. I started noticing that he had started shaving more carefully before coming over. That his shirts were pressed now instead of the wrinkled work shirts he used to wear. That he had started asking my opinion on small things. Whether he should sell his late wife's old car. Whether he should finally retire from contracting work in a way that felt less like casual conversation and more like a man asking permission to build a different kind of future. Summer arrived, and with it came a strange, quiet tension between us that neither of us named out loud. We still had our Sunday visits. We still had coffee and lunch and long afternoons in the garden, Samuel helping me plant tomatoes because Walter had always done the planting and I had never learned how. But there were moments now, small and electric, that hadn't existed before. A hand brushing against a hand while passing a cup of coffee. A held gaze that lasted half a second too long before one of us looked away. A silence that used to feel comfortable, now feeling charged with something neither of us was ready to speak. In July, on a hot Sunday afternoon, we were sitting on my porch after lunch, the same porch where Walter had taken his last breath, and Samuel said, out of nowhere, "Grace, can I ask you something, and you tell me if I'm out of line?" My stomach tightened. Of course. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the little table between us, not looking at me. "Do you ever think about what comes next? For you, I mean. Not Walter. Not the grief. Just you." I didn't answer right away. The cicadas were loud in the trees. "I don't let myself think about it much," I admitted finally. "Feels disloyal somehow, like I'd be leaving him behind." Samuel nodded slowly, still looking at his coffee cup. "Walter wouldn't have wanted that. He told me once, years back, if anything ever happened to him, he didn't want you sitting alone in this house till you were nothing but a ghost yourself. He wanted you to keep living." I felt my throat tighten. "You never told me that." "Wasn't the right time before now," Samuel said quietly. He finally looked up at me, and there was something so open and vulnerable in his expression that I had to look away first. "Grace, I need to tell you something, and I've been putting it off for months, because I didn't want to be the man who ruins a friendship you're leaning on to survive your grief. But I'm getting old, and Walter taught me that life doesn't wait for the right moment. Sometimes you have to make the moment yourself." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Samuel, let me finish, please, before I lose my nerve." He took a breath. "I've loved Dorothy my whole married life, and I don't regret one day of it. But these last 11 years since she's been gone, I've been lonely in a way I never let myself admit, because admitting it felt like betraying her memory. And then Walter died, and I started coming here every Sunday because I made him a promise. That part's true, but somewhere along the way, Grace, I stopped coming here because of a promise. I started coming here because Sunday morning became the best part of my whole week, and it had nothing to do with groceries." I couldn't speak. My hands were shaking in my lap. "I'm not asking you for anything," Samuel continued, his voice rough now. "I know it's only been 14 months since Walter passed. I know you might never feel ready, And if that's the case, I'll keep bringing you groceries every Sunday until I'm too old to drive, and I'll never say another word about it. But I couldn't keep sitting across from you every week, feeling what I feel, and letting you think it was just because of a promise to a dead friend. You deserve to know the truth of it. The porch was silent except for the cicadas. I looked at this man, 70 years old, kind-eyed, weathered. A man who had loved my husband like a brother, and had apparently somewhere in the last year, without either of us noticing the exact moment it happened, started loving me too. I don't know what to say, I whispered. You don't have to say anything today, Samuel said gently. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens after this, I needed you to have the truth instead of a comfortable lie. He stood up, gathered his empty coffee cup, and left that afternoon without another word. And I sat alone on that porch until the sun went down, feeling like the ground beneath my feet had shifted in some fundamental way I couldn't yet map. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed I had shared with Walter for nearly 4 decades, staring at the ceiling, trying to sort through a tangle of feelings that felt disloyal and terrifying. And underneath all of that, quietly and undeniably alive. I got up sometime after midnight and went to the closet, pulling down a box of Walter's old letters. Things he had written me during the 2 years we dated before marriage. Love letters full of a young man's clumsy, earnest devotion. I read through them by lamplight, crying the way I hadn't cried since the funeral, grieving not just my husband but the strange guilt of feeling something for another man, while my heart still ached for the one I had lost. Near the bottom of the box I found something I had forgotten existed. A letter Walter had written me on our 30th anniversary, sealed in an envelope, marked "Open when you need it." I had tucked it away years ago and never opened it, not wanting to think about a future where I might need comforting words from a man who was still very much alive and sitting in the next room. I opened it that night with trembling hands. Walter's familiar handwriting filled 2 pages. He wrote about our 30 years together, about the family we had built, about how grateful he was for every ordinary Tuesday we had spent together. And then, near the end, he had written something that stopped my heart entirely. Gracie, I don't know when you'll read this or why, but if you're reading it because I'm gone and you're struggling to imagine a life without me, I need you to hear something. Don't you dare spend the rest of your life alone out of some misguided sense of loyalty to my memory. I've loved you every single day of my life, and the greatest gift you could give that love is to keep living fully after I'm gone, whatever that looks like. And if there's ever a good man who loves you the way you deserve to be loved, don't you turn him away because you think it would hurt me. It wouldn't. It would make me glad, wherever I am, that you weren't alone. I sat on my bedroom floor and sobbed until the sun started to come up, holding a letter my husband had written 39 years into our marriage that somehow knew exactly what I would need to hear on this particular impossible night. I didn't call Samuel that week. I needed time, real time, to understand what I was feeling and to be certain it was honest, rather than simply the reflex of a lonely woman grabbing at the nearest kindness. I spent that week in a strange, suspended state, going through the motions of my days. But underneath it all was a constant, quiet conversation I was having with myself, and with Walter, and with the ghost of the life I had built with him. I visited his grave on Wednesday, something I did every few weeks, and sat on the grass beside the headstone, telling him out loud about Samuel, about the porch conversation, about the letter I had found. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, I told the quiet cemetery air. I don't know how to want something for myself when the only thing I've wanted for 39 years was you. The wind moved through the trees overhead, and I chose to believe, the way grieving people sometimes need to choose, that it was some kind of answer. I called Renee that Thursday and told her everything. She was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. Mom, she finally said, do you remember what you told me after Dad died? You said the hardest part wasn't missing him. It was being afraid you'd forget how to be happy. I remembered saying that. I think, Renee continued carefully, that loving Samuel, if that's what this is, doesn't erase Dad. It doesn't mean you forgot him. It means you remembered how to be happy again. And Dad would probably be doing a little happy dance about that wherever he is, because you know he never could stand the idea of you being sad. I laughed through tears. He really couldn't. Man would do anything to make me smile, even at his own expense. So maybe, Renee said gently, this is his last gift to you, a good man who loved him enough to keep his promise, and somewhere along the way, loved you enough to want more than a promise could ever be. The following Sunday, Samuel didn't come. I sat by the window all morning, watching the driveway, my stomach in knots, wondering if he had decided the conversation on the porch had ruined everything between us, if he had retreated the way men sometimes do when they've said something brave and then panic about the consequences. By noon, when he still hadn't arrived, I felt a grief different from anything I had experienced since Walter died, a sharp, specific fear of losing something I had only just realized I wanted. I picked up the phone and called him, my hands shaking. He answered on the second ring. "Grace." His voice was careful, uncertain. "You didn't come," I said, and I heard my own voice crack in a way that surprised me. "I didn't want to push you," he said quietly. "Figured after what I said, you might need space, and I didn't want you feeling obligated to have me in your house every Sunday like nothing had changed." "Samuel," I said, "I need you to come over. Not with groceries. Just come." There was a long pause. "Grace, are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything since Walter died," I said, and I meant it completely. He arrived 20 minutes later. I watched his truck pull into the driveway, into that same familiar spot, and I watched him get out, empty-handed for the first time in 52 Sundays, looking nervous in a way that made him seem younger than his 70 years. He walked up to the porch slowly, and I met him at the top of the steps. "I read a letter Walter wrote me on our 30th anniversary, I told him before he could say anything. "He told me that if there was ever a good man who loved me the way I deserved to be loved, I shouldn't turn him away out of loyalty to a memory. He said it would make him glad, wherever he was, that I wasn't alone." Samuel's eyes filled. "Grace, I've spent the last week trying to understand what I feel," I continued, my voice shaking but steady, "and I think I've loved you, in some quiet way I didn't have permission to look at, since sometime around February, when you held my hand over that box of photographs, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in 14 months. I think I've been scared to name it because naming it felt like betraying Walter, but Walter's letter gave me permission I didn't know I needed." Samuel took a step closer, his weathered face open and hopeful, in a way I hadn't seen since before Dorothy passed. "Grace, I need you to know, this isn't about replacing either of them, Walter or Dorothy. I loved my wife with everything I had, and I loved Walter like a brother, and neither of those things has to end for something new to begin." "I know," I said. "I think that's exactly what Walter was trying to tell me in that letter." Samuel reached out and took both my hands in his, weathered and strong and warm. "Grace Whitfield, I am 70 years old, and I have loved exactly one woman in my life until about 8 months ago, when I sat on your porch going through old photographs and realized I was falling in love with my best friend's widow, and it terrified me so badly I almost didn't say anything at all." "I'm glad you did," I whispered. "So am I," he said. And then, slowly, giving me every chance to step back, he leaned down and kissed me for the first time, there on the same porch where Walter had taken his last breath. And it felt strangely and beautifully, like a continuation rather than a betrayal, like Walter's love for me had simply found a new vessel to keep flowing through. The months that followed were not without their complications. Michael, it turned out, had suspected Samuel's feelings for nearly a year and had been quietly encouraging him the entire time, which explained the conversation I had overheard in May. Renee was thrilled, having apparently seen the whole thing coming before I had even let myself consider it. There were harder conversations too. Samuel's daughter, Patricia, who lived in Nashville, had a difficult time at first, feeling that her father moving on so soon after her mother's death, even 11 years later, felt like erasing Dorothy's memory. It took several long, honest conversations, and eventually a visit where Patricia sat with me in my kitchen and asked point blank whether I thought I was replacing her mother. I told her the truth. "I could never replace your mother in your father's heart, Patricia, any more than he could replace Walter in mine. We're not replacing anyone. We're just two people who loved deeply once, and apparently have enough love left over to try again." She cried, and so did I, and by the end of that visit, she hugged me at the door and told me she was glad her father wasn't going to spend his remaining years alone. Samuel and I took things slowly, which felt right for two people in their late 60s and 70s, who understood, better than most, how quickly time could run out and how important it was not to waste whatever time remained. We didn't rush toward anything. We simply kept showing up for each other. Sunday mornings, turning into Wednesday dinners, turning into weekend trips to visit our respective children, turning into a quiet, comfortable partnership built on the foundation of a friendship that had already survived nearly 5 decades before either of us thought to call it love. On the 1-year anniversary of that first Sunday grocery delivery, exactly 52 weeks after Samuel first knocked on my door with milk and eggs and a small bundle of daisies, He knocked again. I opened the door expecting the familiar sight of grocery bags, and instead found him standing there holding an enormous bunch of white peonies, his weathered face split into the widest smile I had seen on him since this whole strange, beautiful journey began. "No groceries today?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "Grace," he said, "I've been bringing you what you needed for a year. Today I wanted to bring you something you just wanted." I had to sit down on the porch steps, my legs suddenly unreliable, holding those white peonies against my chest and looking up at this good, patient, weathered man who had waited 52 Sundays to tell me the truth of his heart, and then waited even longer after that for me to be ready to hear it. "Samuel Reeves," I said, laughing through sudden tears, "are you telling me this whole year was a courtship and I didn't even notice?" He sat down beside me on the steps, taking my hand in his. "Grace, I think it was a courtship neither one of us fully noticed until it was already halfway finished. I think that's probably the best kind." I looked at the peonies, then at Samuel, then out at Cedar Hollow Road where his truck sat parked in that same familiar spot it had occupied every Sunday for a year. And I thought about Walter's letter, about his insistence that I not spend my remaining years alone, about the strange and beautiful way grief and love had woven themselves together into something neither one of us had expected but both of us, it turned out, had needed. "I love you, Samuel," I said, the words feeling both entirely new and somehow already familiar, like a language I had been quietly learning without realizing it. "I love you too, Grace," he said. "Have for a while now." We sat on that porch together as the afternoon light turned gold across Cedar Hollow Road. Two people in their late 60s and 70s, who had both already lived one great love story and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found themselves standing at the beginning of another. 6 months later, Samuel asked me to marry him, not with an elaborate proposal, but with the same quiet honesty that had characterized everything between us. Sitting at my kitchen table over morning coffee, sliding a small ring across the table and saying, "Grace, I already know how this story ends, because I've been paying attention for 52 Sundays. I'd like to keep paying attention for however many Sundays we've got left." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We were married the following spring, a small ceremony in my backyard with our children and grandchildren gathered around us. Renee crying through her role as matron of honor. Michael walking me down a short garden aisle because, he said, someone had to give the bride away, and it wasn't going to be anyone but him. Patricia stood beside Samuel, having become one of my closest friends over the months of our courtship, and at the reception she stood up and gave a toast that made everyone cry, saying that her mother and Grace's husband had both loved these two people so completely that it made perfect sense they would eventually find their way to loving each other. I am 65 years old, and I have now been loved fully and completely by two extraordinary men in one lifetime. First for 39 years by a husband who taught me what steady, ordinary devotion looked like, and now by a man who spent 52 Sundays quietly proving that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with milk and eggs and the good tomatoes from the store 2 towns over, showing up faithfully every single week until you finally understand what has been standing on your porch all along. If you've ever lost someone you loved and wondered whether you were allowed to love again, I want you to hear what Walter's letter taught me. The people who loved us best never wanted our hearts to close after they were gone. They wanted us to keep living, keep loving, keep opening the door on Sunday mornings to whatever good thing might be waiting there, groceries or flowers or the quiet, patient beginning of an entirely new chapter. Love doesn't run out when someone dies, it just waits, sometimes for exactly 52 Sundays, for someone brave enough to finally bring flowers instead of groceries, and for someone brave enough to finally recognize what they had been receiving all along.